Chapter 32. I snoozed the entire day. Mr. Bluebell brought me a pork stew, and the rich flavor of the savory chunks of meat left me suspecting I ate what I killed. My belly full, I might have slept through the following evening, but Tansy showed up in a display of elegant timing just as I spooned the last of the broth into my mouth. "Hey, stranger." She was dressed in loose-fitting white pants and a V-neck top. Her hair was brushed down to frame her face, and I had to admit to myself, the fighting halfling was a looker. "Hey, yourself." I sat up straighter. "What's going on? Hope you don't mind, but I peeked in earlier when you were snoozing. Saw you'd leveled up. Good job, by the way. Believe me when I say I worked for it. I have little doubt. But your work paid off. My dad raved at the quality of the meat, not to mention how you got it back to us while it was still fresh. I can't imagine why you didn't rest before dragging that load back. He showed me your stretcher. Pretty ingenious. You're handy. Thanks. Anyway, when I saw your level, I strolled up the road and had a talk with my promoter. I got you into the fights." I stood despite my aching muscles and listened as she recounted events. While she was punching the speed bag at the gym, the promoter happened by. She convinced him he'd be happy if he signed me on. It had taken some convincing, and I didn't know why she was sure I'd work out, but eventually he agreed. A little movement relieved the remnants of soreness in my body, so when she hired a cart to take her down to the harbor, I tagged along. I managed not to fidget on the ride down, opting to take cleansing breaths while I wrangled my mind into a suitable state of awareness. A messy brain missed important clues, and that was no environment to stroll into with a chaotic mindset. As an added bonus, she explained to me how I could add Ren to my name so it appeared as Ronaldo Ren Cobb. Apparently, nicknames were as fruitful when trying to build a fan base in the virtual world as they were on the outside. But until I earned a title like Bruiser or Destroyer inside the ring, Ren would have to do. We passed the lamplighters for the districts we traversed, hurrying from post to post before full dark. Most were gnomes, and all wore yellow and orange beanies that reminded me of candy corn. I stifled a snort of amusement at the thought. By the time we reached the warehouse district, the night had gotten past them, and signs for after-hours businesses and shady clubs were all that lit some of the streets. The warehouse we sought was nestled among similar structures down by the docks. The whole area was a maze of mostly unmarked concrete block and corrugated tin buildings so unremarkable, none would stand out. Probably the whole idea. Tansy led me to double doors outlined in putrid green witchlight. As fight participants, we bypassed the lineup outside, and the bouncer recorded us on his clipboard before waving us through. Inside, strobing lights and crowd noise thumped my eardrums. Tansy explained the upstairs was a nightclub called Radioactive. Patrons wearing face paint and outrageous outfits appeared ready for an apocalypse. At the very least, they were dressed for calamity. Or, hey, maybe gas masks and leather protected them from what the club's name promised. Downstairs, through a tunnel lined with disturbing soundproofing in the form of plushies nailed to the walls, was the Fight Club. My brow furrowed as Tansy paused to rub the tummy of a huge, ratty pink teddy bear pegged in the center of the right-hand wall. "It's tradition. You rub this one's belly for luck." When I resisted, she shook her head and pointed at it with authority. "Trust me, you don't want bad luck on fight night." Grumbling, I gave the bear a bit of a swipe, then threw my hands palm up. "Happy?" She laughed as she continued down the tunnel, shaking her head at my reluctance, or maybe at my gullibility. I didn't have a handle on her sense of humor yet. I followed Tansy under the dance club, into the dark and smoky arena where the crowd milled in shadows and a spotlight shone on the combat area. The tiers of onlookers jostled along the benches to find seats. They howled like wolves at the moon, sloshing drinks and snacks in the winding frenzy, so the floor was covered in squishy peanuts and bits of meat dropped from wooden skewers. The ring was empty, the sand raked and ready. I didn't know if the man in charge was designed to look Native American or Latino, but just seeing him presiding over the sunken ring from his elevated seat tickled something at the back of my brain. He wore a slick suit, wielded a fancy cane, and rings glittered on every finger. Each grim smile flashed gold and gems in his teeth, reflecting off the spotlight. Then the name of the club upstairs clued me in, and I snorted aloud at the reference to the old music video. Now the plushies made a little sense. What's so funny? Tansy was keyed up for the fight, already bouncing on the balls of her feet, although she hadn't even slung her bag onto the bench by the weigh-in area. Names were scrawled on a chalkboard under the division headings, more being added as they processed the fighters in. I shook my head. Nothing really. This place is great. The corners of her mouth curved like she didn't believe me. They weighed us in, then scribbled our names on the board under the appropriate weight classes. I wasn't sure how my real-world training would translate there, especially when I was still a relatively low level. Hunting the feral hogs was one thing, taking on intelligent beings with a bent for breaking my face, another. This would prove to be an experiment as much as anything. The odd glitter of glass on the floor convinced me to leave my boots on. Rules from my martial arts training about bare feet on the mat didn't apply. The signs in the change room and over the ring weren't lying when they noted there were no rules in the unsanctioned club, and I swallowed a lump when the first pairing resulted in a violent death via a curb stomping on the concrete ledge circling the sand pit. Crimson splashed out from the scene of what should have been a crime, and the winner got a bonus for it when the audience threw rubber-banded wads of cash to show their appreciation. The crowd was bloodthirsty and drunk, waving wads at the bookies. I scanned the dead man's arms as they dragged him out. One featured naked skin. The other was tattooed in a sleeve that traveled from the heel of his hand up to the shoulder in swirls of blotchy color resembling a dragon. My inner cynic rang in as wonderment about whether the corpse had been a player. Was the ink an attempt to disguise the infinity designation of a player character? Was he an 8? If so, what was his game? The player could roll up a new character any time, grind to a suitable level, then do it all again. And if an NPC was killed in the ring, what would it matter in the long run? They'd probably respawn in some fashion. I considered asking Tansy, but what did she really know about 8s? Not much. I vaguely remembered her mentioning that she didn't understand how the reincarnation worked. She was an NPC, and my question was more suited for a mentor. Initially, I suspected the promoter might have been running a scam where the player took a dive, then came back freshly re-rolled for his cash. But that didn't make sense either. The promoter didn't know any more than Tansy, especially if it was against the rules to discuss the outside world with NPCs. I was left intrigued and unsatisfied. There were a million reasons a player might try to cover the symbol. New worry about Tansy sent a chill up my spine. You sure about this? I cocked my chin toward the corpse as they dragged it out of the ring, red streaks creating a trail in the sand like visual echoes of the sheer brutality. In a game where players could get higher than a cloud, it followed that combat would be realistic. But somehow the gore surprised me, and I had to remind myself that in-game, especially in illegal fights, just about anything went. Tansy rolled her eyes and resumed the taping of her hands. Don't worry about me. She put on a sweet smile. I'm saving up for a kitten. I arched a brow as I recalled the beast outside the gym I'd visited. What, like a splat cat? She twitched and shot me an inquisitive look before smiling again. However did you guess? Rolling my shoulder, I smirked. I guess I harbor fantasies that my gang could use a pussy posse. That got a howling laugh, and the kind of rumbling snort reserved for fighters who'd had their noses cracked. But I didn't see any indication of curvature or scarring. Oh, I like that. We should all ride splat cats, but maybe you should hold up your end first. My end. Lyle Bowminster, the guy who Tansy claimed had been stealing from her family. Although I didn't know the extent of his crimes against the Bluebells, my focus was on forming a gang and gaining more allies like Ashley Rainsong, preferably the kind who'd actually enter River City. Don't worry about me doing my part, but when it's done, I say splat cats all around. They look badass. I spotted one outside your gym. I recalled my trip to the natural area that centered the city. Maybe we should go wish for a litter of them at that fountain in the park. Tansy laughed. That old fountain hasn't granted wishes in hundreds of years. Hell, it might never have granted a single one. People and their lore, you get me? She raised an eyebrow. I nodded. You need to find the real thing if you want something cool to happen. Wait, what do you mean, real thing? There's a fountain that actually grants wishes. Oh yeah, and that one's for real. Too much chatter about it across the districts. Although that lore differs from race to race, the fountain's presence in all the stories means it's real. Good luck finding it, though. Families have wasted tons of bucks sending squads out to no avail. Rewards are posted, too. Sounds like a good way to cash in. I say we find it. Her forehead wrinkled, then smoothed. Oh, you're funny. She pressed a hand of splayed fingers to her chest and laughed at the ceiling high above. A new guy walks into River City and finds... She waved a hand as her laughter descended into chuckles. You're too much. Can you wish for anything? She shook her head as she started airboxing. Legend says the boons granted are random, like it gives you what you really need and not quite what you ask for. I'd had nightmares after reading The Monkey's Paw as a kid, and this struck me entirely too close to home. A voice bellowed from behind me and off to the left. Tansy, you're up! The squint of her eyes transitioned to a glare when she turned her focus to the ring. She dropped her fists, shook out her shoulders, then stepped by me like I wasn't there. Ultimate concentration. Good luck! I gave her shoulder a tap with one fist. She gave a single, curt nod in reply. A big orc wearing the expression of the perpetually irritated opened the side gate for Tansy to step through. Her petite opponent entered from the opposite side. Never mind ears. She had a cauliflower nose, and her tight ponytail emphasized every lumpy flaw in her face. I reminded myself it wasn't a beauty pageant, as my heart rate ticked up a notch in anticipation. Pressed up against the boards and wire in the walkway below the first tier of spectators, I looked on. The announcer didn't go in for fancy backstory on the fighters. Tansy versus Vera, as indicated on the roster board to one side of Boss Man. My breath ached in my chest when Vera rushed in swinging a flurry of punches. Double jabs aimed for Tansy's head followed by a wide hook that fell short of her ribs, then an uppercut finisher to the chin. Tansy dodged most, and the last was the only punch that found purchase, but it wasn't quite flush and glanced off. Tansy dipped and dodged, dancing in a circle as they faced off. Vera lunged, grabbed her by the shirt, then launched a cheek-splitting roundhouse, sending my friend's head snapping back. I could see her eye glistening from across the ring. The wound beneath spread to allow tiny rivulets of blood to trickle down. Shit, that's going to swell up good. The announcer gave a gleeful play-by-play amplified by an unseen source in the shadows overhead, but his voice was swallowed whole by the vicious snarls of the crowd. Someone above and behind me was screaming for Vera to fuck up her pretty face. I sneered, then threw my voice into the fray. Break her face, Tansy! Never cheer against my people. When I turned my gaze back to the ring, Vera rammed Tansy against the boards with her shoulder, but Tansy raised her elbows to absorb the follow-up combo. She dipped beneath a hook, then came up with a devastating counter uppercut that caught her opponent squarely on the chin. Red text appeared, then flashed to bold. It shimmied to indicate a critical hit before rising skyward. I pumped a fist. Nice shot! While she had Vera stunned, my halfling compadre delivered a set of kicks to the woman's legs that made her knees buckle. Vera flung her arms in wide, desperate strikes as she tried to regain her footing, but Tansy shoved her with both hands to clear space, and Vera stumbled, then slammed down hard on her ass in the sand. Her eyes flared. She scrambled to get turned over and onto her feet again, but Tansy was on her like a whip, settling her knees on either side of Vera's face to deliver a flurry of downward jabs. Blood spatter flew into the air to paint the halfling's face. She drew her right hand high, then brought it down with devastating ferocity. Vera's struggling arms went limp. I rose onto tiptoes with my fingers curled in the wire, keen to see if the woman was knocked out. Or dead. Tansy held Vera down by the throat lest she was faking and might try to lurch up to attack. She turned her gaze up to the ring boss sitting on his throne, free hand raised in a fist over Vera's face. He dipped his chin, then a bell clanged. Tansy hopped to her feet and backpedaled away from Vera before thrusting her fists into the air. Your respect for Tansy Bluebell has increased to rank 2. Although NPCs receive messages and bonuses related to your respect rankings, they have no bearing on your attributes or skills. I blew a long whistle as I hustled over to meet Tansy at the gate. When I clapped her on the back, she beamed despite the cut under her eye swelling into a flesh bubble. "Good work!" "I know." She grinned, then rubbed her face against the shoulder of her blood-stained shirt. "Come on, I need ice." I followed her to the back room. A beardless dwarf reached into a metal box. He withdrew a pack of ice, then tossed it to her. I eyed the box. Refrigeration, then. Nice. It occurred to me that I still had little indication of the level of technology in the city. Although they lit street lamps, the lights in the club appeared to work via some sort of magic. Ice pressed to Tansy's eye, we returned to watch the next match. I stretched against the boards while we watched an orc pound the snot out of a muscle-bound guy too dumb to tap out when he was obviously doomed. Since he survived, I suspected he'd look even worse than the curb stomp victim by morning. Next up was a centaur in chain armor wielding a longsword against... Is that a fucking unicorn? Tansy nodded. It wasn't some rainbow-colored fuzzy-horsey toy either. It was the most badass unicorn I'd ever seen. The flossy-maned beast wore no protection, but proved an expert at melee. Time after time, it met each sword thrust with a swift parry of its spiral horn. They danced around one another on the sand, hooves throwing up dust. The unicorn's darting hits struck again and again until it wore most of the centaur's blood on his iridescent white coat. For the grand finisher, it lowered its noggin, then thrust its horn through the guy's human chest in what would prove a mortal blow. Just wow. The unicorn pranced around the ring in victory, tossing his blood-matted mane when I spoke to Tansy. I didn't know those kinds of things existed here. The red slashes crisscrossing its iridescent hide knitted back together. Self-healing would be extra fucking handy. I'd have to look into it. Exist here, as opposed to where? A question I didn't dare answer, lest I incur penalties. I shrugged, but I couldn't contain my swelling excitement. That was crazy! Awe-inspiring. Maybe we can get a unicorn to join the gang. It warmed my heart to hear her talk about the potential of our own little guild when I hadn't even laid eyes on Lyle Bowminster. None of the following matches proved quite so exotic. By the time they called my name, the crowd was so riotously drunk I was glad to be on the inside of the cage. I suspected some in the stands would spoil for a fight of their own before the night ended, and security already had a hell of a time keeping everyone in line. Only the big-time players in the box seats appeared cool and collected. I scanned faces, logging features while I waited for my opponent to arrive on the sand.
Yo, just a quick reminder. You can support me on Patreon and receive chapters a week early if you click the link in the description and sign up.